This is Power and Politics. I'm David Cochrane, and former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould will not run for a third term in Parliament. The independent MP told our colleagues at CBC Radio she found Parliament to be a toxic workplace.
My experience in Parliament has been one that has devolved, to use a word, over time. And as I said, I mean, it is a toxic environment that quite vividly and openly marginalizes certain voices.
So what does Wilson-Raybould's decision say about the atmosphere inside the House of Commons? The Power panel is here with me now. Elliott Hughes, Nancy Hepner, Andrew Thompson, and Niigaan Sinclair. Niigaan, I'd like to start with you. I mean, were you surprised when you heard that Ms. Wilson-Raybould was not going to run again?
Well, I guess Carolyn Bennett's message to Jody Wilson-Raybould that she was looking for a pension kind of falls flat here, because if the election's held by October, then Jody Wilson-Raybould won't be getting the pension that she said she was seeking. And the fact is, Jody Wilson-Raybould is a person who's often, been in politics for her own family legacy, has been in it because of the reasons that she seeks for her own riding and also for Indigenous peoples, and simply wasn't getting that within the Liberal Party and now within Parliament itself. And if this is true, and we have to also hear the other calls of other MPs talking, Indigenous MPs talking about toxic environment within the Parliament, I mean, we really have to look at the ways in which Indigenous peoples have been treated within those spaces, because it's very difficult to be an Indigenous MP. You're in a position in which you're being demanded upon by the Indigenous community to serve Indigenous interests, to represent Indigenous interests, because frankly, there are no Indigenous peoples in Parliament that represent Indigenous peoples. They represent Canadian political parties. So that's a very high stress. And then on top of that, you're expected to toe party lines for Canadian parties. And so what does that mean? That often means contravening, ignoring, marginalizing Indigenous peoples in various different projects and programs throughout the country. The very laws of the country are built to exploit Indigenous peoples. And so it's very complicated, and I can certainly see why she's talking about the rancor within Parliament. But the fact is that, Jody Wilson-Raybould is not leaving politics, so let's just call that what it is.
Well, she's going somewhere.
She's been deeply involved over the past 24 hours with the AFN election. I have that on sources, and I can confirm that that's true. And she's going to be deeply involved with the AFN going forward, particularly if Roseanne Archibald will be voted in as national chief today.
Okay, Elliott, well, that's some interesting news there from Niigaan Sinclair, reporting live from CBC News here on the Power panel. Elliott, I want to pick up on her comments about toxicity, because I spoke to Mumalek Kakak earlier on the show today, and she's also not seeking re-election, and used her farewell speech to talk about some of the issues that Jody Wilson-Raybould raised in her letter. She wrote about a regression in the House. It's become more and more toxic and ineffective, in my view, increasingly a disgraceful triumph of harmful partisanship over substantive action. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, very tough words, and I think it's important that we all listen to those words. And I think the fact that Jody Wilson-Raybould is echoing some of those sentiments should suggest that we need to continue to listen. Look, Ms. Wilson-Raybould and the Liberal Party had a great start, and things didn't end very well. But I think that should be put aside today, and I think we should be thanking her for her service over the last number of years in Parliament. But particularly starting to listen to the message that she has to share. A lot of MPs, when they leave, the Parliament and their seats and decide not to run again, claim that it's a very toxic environment and it's not a nice working environment and so on. But particularly in the instances in the time that we find ourselves in, listening to voices like Jody Wilson-Raybould's about what else is happening in society and how it feels like to be an Indigenous person in the House of Commons, there's an extremely important message in there. And it's not the only voice that we're hearing on this. And so there is certainly a message, and there's certainly something for the government and all parties to learn and to take away from these messages, and to really take the time to think about how we can improve, change if needed, the institution of Parliament, to make sure that more and more people feel welcome, and more people feel as though they should be part of this and not excluded from this. So I think today's message from Jody Wilson-Raybould is it's time to listen to it. It's time to think about it and examine it, and then reflect, and then consider what changes could be made in the next Parliament.
You know, Nancy, Jody Wilson-Raybould and the Prime Minister don't agree on a lot of things, but they do agree on the House being toxic right now, though I suspect they might disagree on what is causing that toxicity. But what is your sense of where things are in our national politics right now that, you know, two prominent Indigenous women have said the House of Commons is just not the place for me. It's not a healthy environment.
Well, I have to agree with the others on the panel who spoke before me that I can't speak from, I'm not an Indigenous person. I can't speak to what their experiences are, but the fact that Jody Wilson-Raybould is not the only one who's come out and said these exact same things, I think we do have to listen. I'm all for the, I understand that politics is rough and tumble, and I'm all for the back and forth that happens, whether in the legislature or parliament. But when it starts to become personal attacks, and we saw that last week with Carolyn Bennett, that one-word tweet, that's all it took. And you can see the intention behind that. It's mean-spirited, it's personal, it's not helpful. It doesn't advance anybody's causes, including the government. It takes everybody off track. So if there are things that need to be done to make it a better place, I'm all for that. I think within that rough and tumble, there can be a basic level of respect and inclusion and tolerance and acceptance and working together, because I think either provincially or federally, when parties park some of that toxicity and decide to work together, everybody benefits. And I think that we've moved away from that.
Andrew, I was struck by something that Wilson-Raybould mentioned in her letter announcing she wouldn't run, that very early in the pandemic, things worked. You know, people set it aside, they worked together on programs, fixing programs, adjusting things. But as we get closer to getting out of it, it's just gone back to a very aggressive and angry kind of place. What are your thoughts on what she had to say?
Well, there's a lot to unpack, but Parliament is not meant to be a collegial place. It is a place of competition. It is a place of competing ideas. It is a place of very high stakes. Listening to Nancy, who was of course across the aisle from me when I was in politics briefly, or Nancy was there briefly while I was there. I mean, there was certainly no sense of collegiality. The opposition did everything they could to unseat us. And frankly, we returned whatever favor we could on that. I mean, if we want to change Parliament, I mean, it has to be changed in a number of ways, but it starts with the loosening of the power of the executive branch. It starts with, figuring out how you actually listen to the other voices that are there. And frankly, Jody Wilson-Raybould wasn't great at doing that when she was a justice minister. I mean, she towed the Liberal Party line as hard as she could. And I think when, people look back at her record, as much as she will, make the most of it, there really wasn't much progress for Indigenous people while she was Attorney General. There was, the continued problem with the mandatory minimums that she didn't work on. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission moved nowhere. The issue around the residential schools moved nowhere. I mean, there were all sorts of criticism at the time. So it's one thing, I think, for people to come out of politics and go, oh, gosh, isn't it too bad that we aren't, that this place is no longer nice enough. When they have the power and they've got the ability to change it, why not take advantage and do it then? So I feel a little bit, I'm certainly sympathetic, and I've always been a strong voice for individual parliamentarians having more of a role in the life of Parliament and in policy and in legislation. But let's not, become overly revisionist in terms of what the objective of each of these politicians are, which is to support, a particular point of view that they were elected on, and to get the country to move in that direction.
Okay, Nigan, I want to give you a quick final word on this.
Yeah, let's face the reality of this. Parliament is a racial place, it's a gendered place, and we know which races benefit, we know which genders benefit. We also know what conversations, which laws benefit, which communities, and which genders and races in the country. And the fact is that if a racialized person or an Indigenous person comes in and says, and points out those obvious truths, then we should listen, we should think about the ways in which we do business as a country, and in every workplace we are considering that, particularly if anyone adopts the TRC calls to action. It might be best served for the Parliament to begin to adopt some of those calls to action, particularly in the way in which racial sensitivity, conversations around race, and then ultimately how we operate as a country in terms of treating peoples of race within workplaces. And that is what Jody Wilson-Raybould has been talking about over the past 24 hours.
Okay, we're going to pause this discussion for a second, but the Power Panel is going to return as the Assembly of First Nations votes for a new national chief. Voting for this round has wrapped. We're expecting the results live very soon. That's coming up next.